This is Ned Brooks inviting you to Meet the Press.
Meet the Press is brought to you by the Wheeling Steel Corporation and the Wheeling Corrugating Company. Wherever you go, there's a world of wheeling in the world around you.
Our guest today is Sylvanus Olympio, the President of the Republic of Togo, the smallest independent African nation. President Olympio is in this country as on an official visit to President Kennedy, who has called him an exceptional figure, not only in Africa, but on the world scene. And now here is the first question from Lawrence E. Spivak, permanent member of the Meet the Press panel.
Mr. President, I believe you first came to this country in 1947. Have you noticed any significant changes here in the 15 years that have passed?
Well, my first visit to the United States was in connection with the Trusteeship Council of the United Nations. So in 1947, I saw more of the United Nations, which was then at less success than the United States as a country. If there is any significant change between 1947 and during my present visit, I would say that, of course, the United Nations got a new building now, which they didn't have in 1947. And also that most of the people I knew at the time are no longer there.
Do you think that the hopes you had for the United Nations in 1947 have in any way been fulfilled?
I definitely think so. I have been confirmed more in my view that the United Nations will grow in stature and importance as time goes on.
Mr. President, as you probably know, there are two things that the American people are most concerned with in relationship to Africa. And one of them is neutralism and the other is communism. I'd like to ask you a little bit about neutralism. In an article you wrote in Foreign Affairs in October '61, you said this: "We cannot afford to be involved in the Cold War with all its consequences." And since the Cold War issues are moral as well as economic and political, will you tell us how you can avoid becoming involved in Cold War issues?
Well, you see, the Republic of Togoland, for instance, is the smallest country in West Africa. And all the newly independent West African states are just now very occupied with the economic development of their country. And it's generally believed that we should devote the whole of our energy and time to economic questions rather than be involved with what one might call world problems, with the Cold War, with the atomic bombs, disarmament, etc. This is known in some quarters as neutralism. I don't know if it's the right word for it, but one would like to compare that with the policy the United States pursued in the beginning of her history. I'm now referring to the isolationist policy. At the time when the United States thought the best thing to do was to concentrate all her energies on her home affairs rather than be involved in European and world affairs. So I would say that our neutralism is more or less the same type of thing just now.
But what about the question, as I said, of moral issues? You yourselves have just become independent. You yourselves have just become free. Now the battle the West insists is a battle with the communists on the question of independence and on freedom. Now can you be neutral on an issue of that kind, and are you neutral?
We certainly cannot be neutral when it's a matter concerning individual freedom and national freedom. We're nationalists, and we believe that the freedom for countries which are still independent are so vital that there can be no compromise on that type of principle. So if it's a question of being neutral on questions of freedom, I can tell you that we are certainly for national and individual freedom.
Well, now let me ask you this question. Do you think it's important for the emerging nations of Africa not to become communist?
Well, I know you in America, you are oversensitive about communism. In West Africa, I don't think the danger of communism is so great as you make out. Just imagine that Europeans have been in our country in some parts over 100 years. I don't think they've changed radically our own traditions and our outlook. And I just don't see how communists with their doctrine, their way of life, can come over to West Africa and within few years change our basic conception of life, our basic traditions, that will be really very difficult indeed. And it's true that you have the young intellectuals who come and talk glibly about socialism and communism and so on. But I think you have to look at this, look at the majority of the people who are in West Africa, who have their own traditions, have their own way of life, have their own conception of life. And I don't think communism is going to make much impression on that for many, many years more to come.
We'll be back with Meet the Press and more questions for our guest, President Olympio. But first, this message.
Wherever you are, there's a world of wheeling steel in the world around you. Start in the shadow of Chicago's famous Loop at Marina City, world's tallest apartment buildings. Wheeling is already here. These air conditioning ducts are made of rugged wheeling soft-tight galvanized steel. By the time it's completed, Marina City will contain hundreds of tons of wheeling steel. And the families who live here will use an entirely different wheeling steel, wheeling ductilite, the tin steel used in cans for soft drinks and all kinds of foods. Wheeling steel's also in the new Ranhurst Center being erected at nearby Mount Prospect. It will be the largest, fully enclosed and air-conditioned shopping center anywhere. Builders are installing nearly 1 million square feet of metal lath. Sold by Wheeling Corrugating Company, this expanded metal lath helps fireproof the structure and support its ceilings. Wheeling is just above the ceiling, too. Wheeling tensile form is a strong, permanent form that supports wet cement until it hardens, then adds structural strength throughout the life of the building. Nearly 28 acres of tensile form were used to speed the construction of floors in Ranhurst Center. Chicago's contractors rely upon many other wheeling building materials, too, such as strong, economical wheeling steel pipe for heating and plumbing, and wheeling corrugated metal culvert pipe for dependable permanent drainage of secondary roads and superhighways alike. It's why we say, wherever you are, there's a world of wheeling in the world around you.
And now resuming our interview, our guest today is Sylvanus Olympio, the President of the Republic of Togo. You've just met Lawrence E. Spivak, permanent member of the panel. Our other reporters today are Max Lerner of the New York Post Syndicate, Alastair Cook of the Manchester Guardian of England, and George Clay of NBC News. We'll continue the questions with Mr. Lerner.
Mr. President, although you don't seem to have any anxieties about communism, I'm sure you do about national independence. Your neighbor Ghana and its chief of state, Mr. Nkrumah, have expressed themselves as wanting to reintegrate every people, and make your country a kind of seventh region of Ghana. Now, this is a kind of expansionism which interests us very much, and I wonder what you propose to meet that kind of threat.
I think the best measure to adopt, and that's what we are doing in West Africa just now, is to have a greater cooperation between the African states. As you know, our country belongs to what is generally referred to as the Monrovia Group. And you know the principles on which this particular group is based. No interference in any other country's internal affairs, respect for the sovereignty and integrity of each state. Belonging to such a group, I think that will be the best answer to Nkrumah's intentions or aspirations.
Does that mean, Mr. President, that if there should be an attack, I gather your army is not a massive army in Togo, consisting perhaps of several hundred soldiers. If there should be an attack, would you expect these other members of the Monrovia Group to assist you, or might perhaps, I notice how many times your representatives have voted with the Soviet Union in the United Nations as compared with the United States. Would you expect the Soviet Union perhaps to give you some protection? Or the UN?
We have no particular engagement or convention with the Soviet Union. But I am certain that my friends in the Moravia group would at least give us a moral support, if not a material support. And you know, in this world today, moral support goes a very long way, and that should even deter aggression in a small place like West Africa.
Mr. Cook.
Mr. President, I think that you were the first petitioner before the United Nations Trusteeship Council in 1947, and at that time, or around that time, you said that you had two ideals for your country. One was to see it become an independent republic, and the other was to unite the Ewe peoples. Now, my question is this: isn't there a fundamental contradiction between the independence of a country and the unification of a race or tribe which now lives partly in that country and partly in another country, which has its own sovereignty and is jealous of it?
I don't see any contradiction in it at all. If you have followed our history, during the colonial regime, we didn't come out with an outright demand for independence at the start. We only pointed out the difficulties and hardships these arbitrary boundaries created, that is, between ourselves and Ghana. And we sought at the time to get down some of these difficulties, for instance, customs barriers, to do away with the custom barriers, to harmonize taxation, and also to facilitate movement of persons and properties in a large way. And therefore, if we are independent, at any rate it was my hope that if the Republic of Togoland is independent, and Ghana also being an African independent state, it should be very much easier to achieve these ends, that is, abolish customs barriers, facilitate the movement of persons and properties, and thereby make life very much easier for the Ewe people. You see, in the old days, in the colonial regime, the Ewe people who were living in Ghana were, so to speak, British subjects with British ideas, and we living in Togoland were supposed to be French assimilated persons. All that has disappeared now. We are just pure African citizens of independent states, and collaboration should be very much easier.
Mr. President, you mentioned earlier that you want to concentrate all your energies on economic development. And I wonder, with these multiplying sovereignties of smaller and smaller states in Africa, how can these smaller states survive and enjoy separate economies when the whole movement of modern technology is towards centralization and bigger and much more expensive units?
We appreciate that. And that is one of the reasons why we are trying these groupings in Africa just now. And as you know, those things are not very easy. And we are trying to start with what should be very easy to accomplish in the shortest possible time, and then gradually get on to more and more difficult problems. But we are very much alive to the fact that the African territories must group together if they are to do big things, if they are to have big developments in the various parts.
Mr. Clay.
Mr. President, you've spoken of the African countries grouping together. Bluntly, what is your objection to Togo, which is, after all, such a small country, being incorporated into a larger state like Ghana?
Well, the only objection we have to it is we don't want to be dominated again by another country after having been dominated for so many years by the French. We would like to be having our life as we like to make it, even though we may have economic difficulties. But I must add this, that Togoland, since the German times, has always been a country which has carried its own work, its own burden, without any subvention from the metropolitan country. Many people think that Togoland, as it is small, cannot possibly balance its budget, cannot have enough money to do the most ordinary things. That, of course, is all wrong. In the past, we have done a lot of things, building railways, building walls, building hospitals with our own money, and even, of course, with a little loan from the metropolitan country. But before the last war, there was no subsidy from the metropolitan country.
Mr. President, are you still under pressure from Ghana for the incorporation of the Ewe portion of Togo, and do you think you can hold out?
It is not so much the Ewe portion of Togoland. Ghana would like to integrate the whole of the Republic of Togo. Having achieved the 1/3 of it, which was a British-mandated Togo, Ghana feels the logical conclusion of such a deal is to incorporate the remaining part of Togoland, to which, of course, we object. And then you'll agree with me that with the present conditions in Ghana, nobody will willingly join such a country unless by war, unless forced by war.
Mr. President, you yourself have said that most of the boundaries which today exist in Africa are artificial boundaries imposed by the colonial countries. Why then is there this great desire among all these newly independent countries to retain those boundaries?
Well, it's very easy to understand, you see. Imagine that you are members of the same family, and as it happens in our country, you've all been given plots of land to cultivate. After having worked on that land for a long time, you begin to look at it as your property, and that doesn't belong so much to the family as to yourself. It's exactly the same thing with us. Having occupied a small portion of Africa under one particular regime for many years, we begin to think it's ours, and it doesn't belong to the whole of West Africa.
Mr. Spivak.
Mr. President, last November in the UN, your country, your delegate, voted for a resolution on nuclear testing calling for a moratorium without inspection or controls. Now that is the big issue at Geneva today. The Russians favor such a moratorium. Where does Togo stand today? Where do you stand today on the question of nuclear testing?
We sincerely believe that they should abolish all atomic bomb tests. But we are realists and practical enough to know that we cannot allow or we cannot support some countries to continue making tests whilst asking others not to do it. The best solution, of course, is that all the atomic bomb tests should be abolished. It is in the interest of everybody. But so long as some countries refuse to adhere to such a very wise counsel, it is very difficult for us to insist that other countries shouldn't do it. We can only hope that with the pressure which the small nations can build up in the United Nations, the big powers will agree to stop eventually the testing of atomic bombs.